it's a great honour for me to be able to introduce Peter Drysdale. Many of you will know him, those of you who don't. He's an Emeritus Professor of Economics, head of the East Asia Bureau of Economic Research and the East Asia Forum at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. Peter has written many books and articles on international trade and economic policy in East Asia and the Pacific. If you want his full biography, you just have to Google it and you will get it. So I'm not going to give you all that tonight because it will take about an hour to read. But he is widely acknowledged as the leading intellectual architect of APEC. In fact, somebody might like to ask him later what he thinks of the latest APEC summit meeting. But he's not here for that purpose tonight, generally speaking. He's got another topic to talk about. Now, Peter has been recognised many, many times for his outstanding work in this field. He's won several prizes and awards and honours, including membership of the Order of Australia and the Japanese Order of the Rising Sun. I think, therefore, it's only fitting that the Australian Institute of International Affairs should also recognise Peter by making him a Fellow of the Institute. Now, I want to emphasise this is not just an award from the ACT branch. This is from the Australian Institute of International Affairs as a whole, throughout Australia. We're just lucky enough that Peter happens to be in Canberra at the right time, and we have the advantage of having him here and being able to present the award. So Peter, it gives me great pleasure to present you with this award.
John, thanks very much indeed for the honour that the Institute has bestowed upon me. This is like coming back to family after, well, 50 years or more, honestly, since my early career was nested in the Institute of International Affairs. In many ways, one as a young kid growing up in the bush in northern New South Wales in Armidale, there going to school, being excited every time the Institute brought one of its distinguished visitors to talk with us about world affairs. But then early in my academic career, being supported by the Institute, I think, in modest ways, 75 quid or something like that, but significantly encouraged to do the early work I did on Asia-Pacific economic cooperation that led to my interest in the development of regional organisations in Asia and the Pacific, and ultimately to the work that I did in the lead up to the Asia-Pacific economic cooperation process. So I've spent many hours enjoying the company of the Institute here in Canberra, in Sydney, but in those early years, especially at Dyson House in Melbourne, where I used to go and talk with McMahon Ball, one of your distinguished ancestors, as it were, about Japanese and regional affairs. So I owe much to the Institute, and it's a great pleasure to be able to repay that, because I know, having received this weighty symbol of something, now I have to sing for the supper, my supper, because I'm an economist, and we all know that when you get something, you have to do something in return. I want to talk to you about the white paper on Asia in Australia in the Asian century this evening. And I'll talk rather briefly, if you don't mind, so that I can open it up to as many questions from different angles as you may possibly wish to ask. The Asian century is here. We're in it. Something extremely big is already going on in Asia. The scale of it and the speed of it has taken many people by surprise. Those of us that have worked on Asia over a long period of time saw something coming, but I venture that very few people saw the scale, rapidity, the impact of what has happened in Asia in the last, especially the last 2-3 decades or so, coming in the way that it's come. It's not a matter just of scale, sure, the scale. It's also a matter of degree. The fundamental change has taken place in the way in which Asia has transformed itself in a period of, maybe not much more than a quarter of a century, through an industrial revolution that's happened in such a concentrated space of time and brought so many millions of people out of poverty in the process, compared with what happened in Europe back in the 18th century, when it took close to a century to lift Britain and then Europe out of poverty, and the United States followed and so on. And we've had a relatively stable structure of world economic power since then, around the established economic powers in Europe and North America, until all this has happened in Asia. So the Asian century is certainly here. It's here in a variety of ways. It's here in terms of what growth in Asia has done to the income shares of Asia in world trade and in world output, and what it's done to the share of Asia in world trade. In the early 1960s, Asia accounted for something like 15% of world output. Last year, Asia accounted for close to 30% of world output, and that puts it alongside North America. In fact, it's bigger than North America already. And alongside Europe, it's roughly the same size as Europe, in terms of its importance as a centre of world economic activity. This has brought with it, as I said, a huge growth of the middle class in Asia. In China alone, by various standards, the middle class has grown to something like 200 million people in the space of 30 years or so. And overall of Asia, there are something like 350, 400 million people that have been categorised by the OECD measure as belonging to the middle class. That means having a substantial disposable income to spend on things that you and I spend on, like nice flashy television sets and so on. Maybe you spend on that, and more modest in my taste, but and travel, and increasingly housing, and of course motor vehicles and so on. So that's all happened. It's happened in a way, of course, that ultimately has changed the shape of the structure of world economic power, making Asia for the first time. Japan was there beforehand, but relative to what's happened since Japan peaked at the end of the 1980s, when it held about 8% share of world output, for example, this is much, much bigger and much more profound in terms of its impact on the structure of the global economy. And of course, all of this has impacted on Australia in a significant way. Our share of trade with Asia has been substantial and long since we opened up to the potential of growth in Japan in the mid-1970s with the Agreement on Commerce with Japan. And Japan led the growth in our relationships, economic and other, with Asia in the post-war period. Ironically, given the history of the war and how we brought ourselves, both Japan and Australia, through that to normalisation of the arrangements between Australia and Japan through the 1950s and 60s. But in recent times, the speed of the growth of our interaction with Asia has been very much more rapid. Already, China is our largest economic partner. Already, our trade share with Asia is roughly 3/4 of our total trade, a little bit under that. Already, China is the largest source of foreign students in this country. It's the largest source of migrants now in this country, and it's the largest source of tourists just this year in this country. And of course, it's the third largest source of foreign direct investment in this country. And all that's happened really dramatically within the space of a little less than a decade. Not only Australia is affected by this, and Australia is actually among the most East Asian-oriented of economies anywhere in the world in terms of exposure to Asian trade, investment, and other commercial activities. But it's also changed the structure of regional trade. If you look at East Asian trade about a decade or so ago, little less than a decade or so ago, 23% of East Asian trade went to the United States. 10% went to China. Today, that's in the last measured year, which is 2011, 23% of East Asian trade goes to China and 10% goes to the United States. So that's a profound change in the structure of economic relations between our region, China, and its traditional trading partners in Asia. This is partly a product of the importance of geography and distance for all the economies in our region, where there's been this big growth of industrial output, and naturally when you're cheek by jowl with that, Australia has had the disadvantage historically of being a long way from the centre of industrial growth. Nonetheless, with its strength in resource endowments and so on, developed strong established trade relations early with Europe. But without the centre of economic and industrial activity shifting towards Asia as it has, we wouldn't have this kind of interaction in the global economy that we now have with Asia. That's happened, so geography has been important to that. Our strength and efficiency, competitiveness in the resource sector has been important to that. And so too is the juxtaposition of all the other economies in the region, first Japan, of course, then other Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and now India, in bringing an agglomeration of economic activity together in a way that inevitably affects the intensity of the interactions between the economies in this part of the world. That's International Economics 101. A lot of people don't understand International Economics 1, and I'm prone to tell them what International Economics 101 is all about. And it's about distance, and it's about scale of output. And distance and scale of output basically influence very, very powerfully, and it's measurably so, the strength of interaction between economies. And that's why you have the intensity of interaction between the Asian and Asian Pacific economies that you have, because of these powerful two determinants of economic interdependence among countries. This has had regional impact. I've just described it briefly, but it's also had global impact. And there's no more clear testament of the global impact that it's had than, of course, the response to the global financial crisis of 2008, which required drawing in the major Asian economies to participate with the old G7, G8 economies in trying to produce a strategy which would coordinate an effective response to the global financial crisis. This couldn't have been done effectively, a response to the global financial crisis that saw a massive stimulus of global demand through the commitments that the G20 economies made in the early phases of the crisis. This couldn't have happened in the same way without participation of what are now among the biggest economies in the world. Japan, of course, was there to begin with in Asia, but drawing in Korea, drawing in China, drawing in India and Indonesia, has seen the structure of global governance change fundamentally as these emerging powers, alongside the emerging powers in Latin America, Africa and elsewhere, Russia and so on, have become routine members of the decision-making process at the global economic table that the G20 constitutes. That's a remarkable event, and I want to sort of dwell on that for a moment when you think about it. People sometimes say that the transition of power that's associated with the emergence and strength of new powers, such as you've seen in Asia and elsewhere in the world in the last 30 years or so, can't easily be affected without friction and conflict. But here's evidence of a devolution of power, not legislative power, not power over sovereignty in any way, or any aspect of sovereignty in any way, but power of decision-making at the key table to the emerging powers from the established powers. And that happened really effectively under the Bush administration in the United States, and then was carried forward by the Obama administration, of course, and was entrenched through the solidification of the G20 as a major centre of global decision-making on economic affairs. We can talk a little bit about how robust that process is later on perhaps, but it's there. And of course Australia is at that table, and Australia has a powerful interest in making that process work because key players in that process now are our most important partners in Asia and the Pacific. Well, this is the context really in which the Prime Minister made the announcement in a speech to Asia Link in Melbourne in September last year to establish a white paper process in Australia to consider the implications of these big changes on Australian policy strategies and on the Australian community. Her speech is worth a read because it does define a strategic moment in the consideration of these circumstances which require a really significant policy response in Australia and community response in Australia if we are to succeed in taking most advantage of the opportunities that the Asian century, it's now become commonplace to describe it, presents. The interesting part of the process is that this is the production of the white paper has occasioned the drawing together of a significant task force from the public sector here. More than 20 senior officials from the relevant policy departments, DFAT of course, Treasury, PM&C, the things located in PM&C, to work on the production of the white paper. So there's a task force, and then alongside the task force is this advisory committee, which is an interesting thing too, a creature in itself. The advisory committee comprises 3 senior officials from within the bureaucracy, Heather Smith from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Gordon de Brouw from the Prime Minister, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and David Gruen from the Department of the Treasury, and 3 outsiders, myself, Catherine Livingston, who's the chair of Telstra, and John Denton, who heads up Cause Chambers and Westgarth, the lawyers, but is also chairman of the International Committee of the Business Council of Australia. And that's chaired, that committee, and the whole process is directed and guided, of course, by Ken Henry, whom you'll all know and doesn't require any interaction from me, and who's been a prominent figure in articulating the mandate and interest of the white paper process. So it's an interesting operation. It's pretty unusual to produce a white paper in this fashion. Mostly white papers are done in some particular arm of the bureaucracy, a defence white paper in the defence, and people are mobilised in that department and so on. It goes up to the minister ticks it off, takes it to cabinet and so on, and the white paper is cleared and approved. But clearly the structure of this thing involves a lot more than that. It's interesting that the outsiders, myself and Catherine and John, are on this thing because that brings a particular dimension to it. I want to come back to that in a moment because I think it's an important dimension that has often been missed in the public commentary. But the other aspect of it that's interesting is that the outsiders actually have been made members of a subcommittee of Cabinet that's guiding the whole process through. And we meet with the subcommittee of Cabinet, which is a large subcommittee of Cabinet, every month or so, less than a month often enough, to talk about the developments in the work and the direction of the work and the outcome of the work. And that's a process that's ongoing. We'll have one more meeting before this process is finished, which accounts to, in some measure, for why the delivery of the white paper is still a little way off, because the logistics of fitting all this thing together is rather complex, to put it mildly, and then of course we'll have to go through another cabinet process before it's ticked off, and then it'll have to be printed. So it'll be a little way off before it's actually released, I think, publicly yet. Can't say exactly when, even if I did know exactly when, I probably couldn't say exactly when it was going to be. But that's really quite an unusual process, and so far as I'm aware, it's never happened in the history of Federation before to have a white paper process like this. And it wasn't done by accident, it was done purposely, because there was a sense in which the Prime Minister and her advisors, who conceived of this notion, wanted to reach out beyond government to engage the public in various ways, and I'll say more about that in a moment. The way in which the whole exercise has been structured is a reflection of that, as are other aspects of the way in which the work has been done. And that's the point I want to make. The scale of the task is quite huge. I mean, you know, I've been working on Asia and in Asia for quite a bit around the country and around the region. But when you sort of try to put something like this together, a considered view of all aspects of not only our relations with Asia, but developments in Asia and what their implications might be more broadly, not only their impact directly on Australia, but their impact on regional affairs and global affairs, it's quite an exercise. And the resource base in this country is pretty good for doing this sort of exercise, and you know, we've been teaching people for 40 or 50 years to sort of measure up to the task. But when you actually start to do it, you think, well, there's a long way still to go, because it's a big job. And it requires bringing together resources from across the public sector. But it also requires, sensibly, extensive consultations throughout the community. And we've had endless consultations. I'm going again early tomorrow morning to Tasmania for more consultations with a whole range of interest groups down in Tasmania. It's the end of the process, but it's the beginning of a process in Tasmania where they, alongside other states, have committed to doing their own Asian Century White Paper on the back of the national Asian Century White Paper. Western Australia is doing one, Northern Territory is doing one, I understand Victoria is doing one. There's a lot of the states are going to do. We've had consultations, various members of the committee and the task force. We've had consultations with all levels of government, all these levels of government across Australia. We've met business groups at all levels, organisations, but also individual businesses. Of course, we've met with the education institutions, met with community groups, and had public meetings and so on in an extensive range of national consultations. So it's out there in a big way. As you will have noticed, I expect, it's got really quite a wide press and there's wide engagement. And the Asian Century idea is caught on. So there's been a big base actually provided for that. We've had columnists writing about the Asian Century, even the Australian writes every day or so about the Asian Century. So it's an idea that has caught on and that really has high expectations now put upon it in terms of working out what to do about the Asian Century from an Australian perspective, which is one of the little worries that you have if you're in the middle of the process. The participation and interest in it is extreme, so it has really high expectations out there about what we're going to do, how we're going to solve everybody's problems in respect of our dealings in various ways with Asia. I'm going to disabuse you of the fact of that in a moment, but that's a pretty important thing. It's, I think it's an entirely encouraging thing. And as I go around Australia myself, and I know Ken has the same experience, he's been with me sometimes and independently we've gone around, we talk to people out there, we receive the submissions, we engage with the press and so on. What the most encouraging aspect of all that to me is that, if you took the same exercise forward 15, 20 years or so ago, you'd have a totally different conversation about this. For a start, people might recognise their deep inadequacies, institutions, firms, even universities, their deep inadequacies in terms of responding to the scale of what's already taken place so far. But there's a strong sense out there across all sectors of the community of being a part of a process. So there's a sense in which Australia doesn't see itself outside this process, but sees it inside this process. And that's a very different thing, I'd suggest, from the feeling you would have got if you'd done this 15 or 20 years ago. A very different thing indeed. And we may be a long way from sort of getting our minds around all the dimensions of this, but we've made a lot of progress at the same time in that perspective. It is, however, a government white paper, and the government will own it and sign off it. The question of its exceptional character that I've talked about a bit makes it a bit of a different white paper, and I would imagine, as you heard, if you saw and heard the Prime Minister interviewed by Jim Middleton on the Asia Pacific program on ABC before she came back from Vladivostok on Sunday morning, you get a sense of it from that interview. What she conveyed there was a strong sense of national engagement in the process. Not ownership of the process, national engagement in the process of working through the issues associated with developments in the Asian century and how we respond to them. And I think that's going to be a key part of it. Success or failure, in my view, and this is not necessarily a view that's shared by all the participants in the process, close to the process at this point, but I've said it publicly and I say it now, success or failure is going to depend importantly on whether we begin an intelligent national conversation on these things through the white paper process, and we set up a process that continues that conversation and engages all parts of the community, also in a bipartisan way in it. Now there'll be some things in there that the partisans, of course, will object to, have a problem with, might have to do with, some infrastructure that's being set up in Australia or that is a bit partisan out there. But there'll be very few things, I think, that as already indicated by the development and thinking across the political spectrum in Australia, that political leaderships on both sides of the political process in Australia will want to run away from. On the contrary, they want to engage with it. One of the important aspects of this, in thinking about all this, of course, is to think not only about the opportunities and the challenges of achieving the benefits from Asia's growth involved, but also thinking about the risks attendant to this process. And when you have a thing like this on the scale that has taken place over the last 20, 30 years in Asia take place, there are always risks associated with it. It pushes barriers and frontiers, the envelope, in many, many different ways. Question of whether China can sustain, even as it officially forecasts its growth to slow down, sustain that transition of growth through a fairly strong growth period now to maintaining a relatively strong growth through until it has demographic transition in 15 years or so, serious demographic transition in 15 years or so. So there are risks associated with that, the management of that process in China and so on. And you've got to take those into account. There are risks associated with the impact of this on global markets, energy markets, food markets, resource markets. We know about those because the sharp impact that this growth has had, resource-intensive growth in China has had upon Australian and global commodity markets until this point. They're up again today, but they've probably peaked roughly, and they're still going to cause a lot of growth in output from Australia and other parts of the world, but at a different price level, a lower price level from what we've enjoyed, with a 140-year peak in our terms of trade over the last 5 to 7 years or so. So all of these risks have to be taken into account in thinking about how you prepare for the Asian century. You've got to have a response that takes into account the management of the risks, both economic and political, as well as what benefits might continue to flow from Asia's growth. And then there is the issue which Hugh White has famously put on the table here, and appropriately and correctly put on the table here, in terms of the challenge to thinking about how all this affects the structure of world economic power and beyond economic power, political power, and the way in which we relate to our established alliance partners, importantly the anchor alliance partner in Australia, the United States, and how we relate politically to the new powers emerging in Asia, China, Indonesia and India in particular, and the management of that, and whether, as Hugh puts it, in some circumstances we might have to make choices of some kind or other. He's got some fairly sharp, hard-edged choices that he posits, and they may not be the ones that we need to think about most actively, but there are various choices and strategies we have to think about and develop if we're going to respond intelligently to those changes now, because a response and thinking intelligently about them now will prepare us for making them, even if it's 10, 15 years' time down the track. So, just to get to the crux of it, what are the priorities that the Asia Century White Paper that should focus on and has focused on, without telling you all the punchlines? The most important thing, of course, this time round, I say this time round because we had an exercise which Ross Garnaut did of a similar kind back in 1988-89 when he produced a kind of white paper. It was a report to government on the Northeast Asian ascendancy, which looked at the first phase of this process when Japan and Korea, Northeast Asia, were having their impact in the first round of Asian engagement in Australia. And the big message that he brought to government, the community, and which led the reform process in Australia was that getting this right depends most importantly on getting things right at home, getting things straight at home. Not only economically, but also socially, being confident about how you position at home in policy terms, and also in economic policy terms, but also in social policy terms. So what needs to be done at home is a primary focus of interest in the work. It involves an ongoing process of economic reform. When you think about the unfinished business of economic reform in Australia, there's huge amounts of it. You just think of just simple things like getting the infrastructure right to efficiently connect to the Asian economy, and the incompleteness of economic reform around dealing with major infrastructure investments that we have to make, which cross state borders or involve federal-state relations in various ways. All of those issues are critical issues in dealing with the impact of Asian growth on the Australian economy. We have to get the social policy settings right too, because as we go in to a process of deeper engagement, integration, Ken calls it, with the Asian economy, we have to be confident in our social policy frameworks, have confidence in what we are and how we manage ourselves in that respect as much as we do in managing the economic dimensions of this. So that's an important focus of interest as well. We have clearly to think about what economic initiatives are of priority in dealing with the changed structure of regional and international economic relations that these changes in Asia have brought. A priority, as I suggested earlier, is on the global arrangements. And let me make this point, let me stand back and make this point. It's a really important point. It's a simple point, but a lot of people, again, don't think about how important it is. When you think about what's happened in Asia over the last, not just the last 30 years with China and all that, but the last 60 years since the war, with Japan recovering and resuming its place in the League of Nations properly recognised. That couldn't have possibly happened without the framework of international institutions and norms of behaviour that were established in what's commonly called the Bretton Woods system and the United Nations system after the Second World War. It's a legacy of, well, importantly, Allied and American contribution to international public goods. And most of you wouldn't know, although one or two of you are just about old enough to know, that here in Canberra, when the Americans came to deliver the ships and boats that I saw in the wartime period in Sydney Harbour and went up to do the Battle of the Coral Sea and so on, we had a big negotiation with America at that time about the terms upon which we'd receive Lend-Lease, as it was called in other parts of the world, these ships on free loan. And the core settlement that we made with the United States at that time was a settlement to commit to the framework that was established through the United Nations and through the Bretton Woods system after the war, and to retreat from the old British Empire system and discrimination against America, against Japan, and against economies that were not within the British Empire system. That changed fundamentally the approach to Australian foreign policy and foreign economic policy strategy in the post-war period. Those wartime pacts between the United States and Australia were our part of commitment to the institutions that made it possible for countries, victor and vanquished alike, as the Atlantic Charter said, countries like Japan and the other East Asian economies to confidently engage, as they had to develop, in international economic activity in the way that they've done in the post-war period, in the way that they couldn't do in the interwar period because they were so heavily discriminated against in so many ways. The G20 is the latest manifestation of sort of this evolving framework. We had it earlier as things needed to be done between the major industrial powers from the 1980s on, the G7 process. But now we have it in this wider framework encompassing the emerging powers. And as I said before, that's necessary to coordinate policy effectively at a global level, to initiate reforms and so on where necessary, to encourage norms of behaviour between the major powers, including the new powers that don't automatically come to the process with established record in these areas, in ways that will allow effective policy development, sharing of policy experience to keep the global system on track. Put briefly, there are a lot of dimensions of that I'm happy to talk with you about later on. The third and final thing, no, I should say that that's the global side of the international initiatives we have to think about, but the regional side is how to make the regional architectures we have in place at the moment, which is principally the APEC process and now the East Asian Summit process, the East Asian arrangements, also includes India, of course, work effectively to address not only economic cooperation problems, but the increasingly important political interaction between the major powers in our region, including the United States. And of course that's what the East Asian Summit is sort of aims to do. It's not going to do it alone because, first of all, there's a sort of hole in the middle of the donut there. There's essentially economic cooperation is outside that. So APEC process alongside the East Asia process are two important platforms. And over the next several years, these things have got to evolve in a way that really provide sureness in delivering the response to both economic cooperation and the political issues that are raised by these developments in Asia. The final set of issues, which I just shot out of, that of course importantly we have to address, is the national capabilities that we have to bring to bear on policy development, the development of business engagement with the region, but also the basic educational requirements of the community, but also all sectors of the community, public sector, business sector, and elsewhere, through our educational institutions, our research institutions, across the country. Now, again, people ask how adequate these are and so on, and again, tend to look at the glass half full rather than the glass half empty, but we've had a lot of investment in these areas over a long period of time. But the truth of the matter is that, in respect of Indonesian studies in Australia, it's going backwards. It's going backwards at a time when Indonesia is set to become the 6th largest economy in the world within a couple of decades. So there's something wrong with how we're doing things. And basically Asian studies, except Chinese studies, and there's some problems too, is going backwards. So we have to think seriously about investing more in the capabilities we have in our public sector, but really in the business sector and across the community to actually engage in the Asian century effectively. What are the lessons so far? And I'll conclude very quickly. I've talked much longer than I should have, John. First is, as I've mentioned already, the stakeholder and community response, which is full of expectation but full of engagement. The recognition of the importance and ambition of the white paper study, I think, is gaining traction out there. I think that there's been a degree of success in that. Ken will frankly tell you that he learned a thing or two about trying to deliver the taxation white paper when he came to this business of trying to deliver a paper on the Asian century, which has many more dimensions, complex though taxation is, many more dimensions to it than his big work on taxation. As I said, it's the beginning of a national conversation, not the end of it. The white paper can't pretend to produce solutions to all problems. Many of the processes we've got to set in train will take some years to deliver. Many require exploration and testing before sensibly you commit to a particular strategy on them. And part of the process will be to set the direction for exploration and testing of strategies rather than commit to a particular process or particular strategy. If you take, for example, the relationship between the major new economies that we need to engage and polities that we need to engage in Asia, China, Indonesia, India, you think about the development of more comprehensive relationships with these economies and polities than we have currently. We have a pretty comprehensive relationship with Japan in various ways, which was cemented in the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation in 1976 after a big struggle by Whitlam and then Malcolm Fraser. And that sets the reference points for our relationship there, establishes quality of treatment, a whole range of things. We haven't got such a comprehensive relation. There's a lot more to be done with Japan as well. So it'll be a subject of attention. But with the new ones, there's a lot more still to be done. When you think about setting the direction on that, clearly it'll be done better if there's a defined process of exploration that takes place, including in partnership with the parties concerned or important actors within the parties concerned about how to go forward. And of course, these things won't change immediately, they'll change over time. The other thing that is really very important about the process is that, as the Prime Minister said on Sunday, it's a matter of engaging the community in response to these circumstances, as well as governments trying to deliver the response to these circumstances, because there's a limit to what government can do in this. And if you think about what's happened already in the Asia Century White Paper, there's already been quite a significant response from the institutions. Mark Smith from ANZ is leading a task force supported by AsiaLink down there in Melbourne on Asia capabilities in the Australian workforce, which presented a strategy last week in Sydney, which will see a major change in the whole approach to training within corporates across Australia. It engages corporates across the whole corporate community. Even the ANU here we've got the biggest asset anywhere in the English-speaking world, really, working on Asia. Is it doing a great job? Well, sure, it's doing a great job. Is it operating up to potential, given the challenges that we have in the developments that surround us in Asia? No way. And so it's already committed to a whole lot of initiatives as a part of this process to change its strategies and its approach to undergraduate training in Asia. It'll become a requirement for all students going through the programs at the ANU to spend a year abroad as a part of their routine training at the ANU, the degree process at the ANU, and that, of course, in Asia. So that's already happened. That's a consequence of actually focusing the mind because of the white paper process. Similar things are happening in Melbourne University, in Sydney University, in Queensland University, in Western Australia, University of Western Australia, and so on. So that is a very important part of the process. So it's not only government delivering new policy approaches and strategies, it's also engaging the other interests and elements in the community to do likewise. Now, what we're doing here is really trying to set policy directions for the future, engaging business, the intellectual community, and the community leaders in policy development. I think that underlines the point I made right at the beginning, and it should be the point on which I'll basically end, John, which was a character of the process. The way in which it's set up actually was a very, very wise. I didn't understand at the time, I've got to say, exactly how wise it was, but I do understand it, having been through 80% of the process now. It was a very wise strategy because essentially it set itself up in a way that would seek to engage the community. The government can't talk to itself in the way it would normally talk to itself with a bunch of outsiders sitting there asking questions about, what about this out here and that out there and so on, having to be engaged. And certainly, the Cabinet Committee can't do that. So that was a hard thing to do. It was, in a sense, a courageous thing to do, in my view, on the part of the Prime Minister and her advisors. But I think it's had the right outcome so far. We'll see when the ink's dry on the paper and it's delivered in a few weeks' time. Thanks very much, John.
Thanks, Peter. I'd like to take some questions now.
Cool.
So, Ambassador?
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Swedish Ambassador. I remember you once had a Prime Minister who used to say that Asia is what you fly over when you go to Europe. He said this tongue-in-cheek, and he actually now says that he was the first one to see what was actually happening. But I think basically he had a point, because when you walk the streets in Sydney and Melbourne, it's a very multicultural society. When I meet my colleagues in the public administration, in the government, it's a very European society. So a very blunt and undiplomatic question would be, if this is going really to have an effect, don't you really have to take drastic actions and basically tell people to forget about Europe and US? It's Asia that is on the agenda.
Well, it's wonderful to meet an undiplomatic ambassador.
I'm well known.
But no, not quite. I mean, Europe's very important to the rest of the world, still remains important. North America remains important. It's one of the three major centres of world economic activity and world economic power. However more important Asia is going to become, Asia will become, on the most conservative projections, roughly 50% of world output by 2025. That's not very far away. I might still see that. It's really quite amazing. Maybe it might take a little longer if growth is not quite so robust. But the shift is inexorable. given what's going on and given the dynamic of that and how it's likely to maintain momentum despite the shocks from time to time. But Europe and the established economic and political powers will remain important in that, especially the transition period, especially over the next 15, 20 years or so. We can't take our eyes off those balls in any way. You're right, though, about the variegation, let me put it that way, in preparedness for coping with the Asian century, and why, for various reasons, the structure of capacities, capabilities across our community is rather different in different sectors. And your observation, when you do this exercise and sit down, I'm a part of the Canberra kind of scene, you sit down together and you think, we're thinking about the Asian century. You look at that, where's the problem? The problem, dear Brutus, is in ourselves, very importantly. So there's no question that it will require, as Ken, I think the Prime Minister has said publicly, a change in mindset. And that importantly in the public sector. If this ends up being a sort of list of, business, you do that, you do this, education institutions, instead of let's look at how we're doing things ourselves and do things ourselves in a very different way, then it will have failed. So there is a very big task there, and that will be a very important measure of the quality of the report and its impact, and it will mean fundamental changes in the way in which things are done in the public sector and also in the business community.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for your presentation, Professor. My brother and I went to China last year. Two things we saw which were very surprising. We went to burger bars and we saw 4 girls sitting around a table eating burgers and drinking coffee. But they weren't chatting about their boyfriends. They were doing their homework. They weren't even talking to each other. How's that for a cultural difference? Second, every Chinese young person comes running up to you. Hello, what are you doing in China? They speak English. Culture. You didn't really mention the word culture during the presentation, Professor. And the third point I want to make is speed. If we are to catch up with Asia, don't we have to do what you're going to set out in your white paper fast?
Well, I think there are 3 very important points. The first one, in a way, symbolises a very important part of the change in mindset that's necessary here if we're going to get things right. I think there's been some publicity over the last week or so about education benchmarking, given the new commitments to education policy. But in a whole range of areas, including education, we have to start to benchmark ourselves against Asia now, not against Switzerland or somewhere, or Sweden or wherever it was.
Switzerland.
We've got to set new benchmarks, and a whole range of things, technologies and scientific research included. So I think your first story sort of tells a bigger story of that kind. And I think, and there's certainly no question that the language thing is important. We're probably, apart from the United States, the most monolingual country in the world, excepted for our 30% or close to 30% overseas-born population. 10% of the Australian population, 1/3 of that 30%, is Asian-born. So we have a linguistic capacity naturally, at least in the first generation of new Australians, from Asia. But is that adequate? As some fellow from the Centre for Independent Studies, independent it is, independent of idea, in dealing with our interaction with the Asian Asian society? There's no way it is. One, because a priority for the Asian community is actually getting to work in Australia effectively. And two, because 90% of the population is so thoroughly monolingual, and becoming more so, it's a bit frightening, discouraging anyway to somebody like me. So there's a big challenge there, and I think there's no question it relates to your question, Ambassador, about the dramatic changes that have to take place. I think there's got to be commitment to opening up the opportunity for every kid to have exposure, not necessarily to fluency in language and so on, but certainly a language at an early age, I mean primary school age, or Asia-related teaching at an early age, and then have that opportunity maintained throughout school career and certainly at the university level for deeper professional specialisation. So if we don't do that, we're not only losing opportunities for enriching our own culture and society through interaction with our neighbours, but we'll certainly be losing opportunities to do business and to do policy effectively with our region.
Michelle.
Thank you. I might sit down if I may. Not setting aside or diminishing all the many challenges you've identified, and they're huge. I actually feel really excited by the possibility that we're on the cusp of a great national enterprise. Now, to actually achieve that, we have to have a sympathetic response from within the region. And I wonder how much of that aspect the study, the white paper is looking at, because we could otherwise just be singing to ourselves. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm glad you raised that question because, I didn't mention earlier in the consultations we've had, we've also had extensive consultations around the region. Ken and the task force have visited Indonesia, India, China and so on, spoken with a whole lot of people, because others, like Catherine and myself, are regularly in the region and engaging in similar conversations. And there's an immense sympathy out there for the process too. I mean, the most common response I find in the region is, why aren't we doing this? Everybody is confronted, as I said, through the numbers earlier on, about what the impact of all this has been on the region itself. The same problem. The whole range of the same problems, economic and political. So there is a sense that this is a common interest in the region as well. So I think that engagement at that level, of course, is very narrow and thin, but has been an entirely positive engagement. I think how we carry it through will depend on the quality of the argument in the white paper itself, finding. If we get that wrong, we deserve to have ourselves marked down and to re-evaluate it. I hope we don't, but if we do, we need that scrutiny. The external scrutiny will be almost as important, as you suggest, as the internal scrutiny.
Yes.
Esther Sainsbury, formerly 5 years in the Defence Department, but now just changed to AusAid. The kind of process you've described for the white paper really reminded me of the Defence white paper process, going to the community, talking across various constituents and taking quite some time to deliberate the question of China. And the interesting outcome of the Defence white paper, which I'm sure we're quite aware of, was the China question that was very strongly driven by the government. And I was wondering what your opinion or your insight might be into the difference between the Rudd government's approach to China, as we saw in the Defence white paper, really explode into something more than many of us had expected, to the Gillard approach.
You sure you're not from the press? That's what they call a hypothetical. Well, it's a good question. It's a good question. But I don't think this. Kevin's an old mate of mine, so I'm being very careful. I don't think this process would have been entered under the former government. I don't think it would have been entered. The way in which it's been done, the nature of the process, the engagement in the discussion through the process is reaching out in various ways and bringing things together and coordinating things in a way that's really quite distinctive. So I think that's an important aspect of it to understand. I mean, that's a sort of, I shouldn't have this sort of off the record, is it off the record? But it's an insider's view of how the processes work. So I think at the end of the day, however, advisors and so on will have to sign off on this as a government paper, and they'll have to stand up and they'll have to deliver it in a political process. And so they will ultimately have to consider their own political interests in doing this. And I don't know I can't tell you honestly what the final outcome of that will be at this time. But what I'm telling you is a story that's pretty encouraging, I think. So,
Melissa.
So Melissa,
this is an insider's question.
I'm the National Director of JAA. I was just going to follow on with the political question, that when we're looking at something of this scale and seriousness, ideally one likes it to have a long duration and to have bipartisan support. And I'm interested in what indications you might have got on whether that sort of bipartisan support might be forthcoming.
Well, we've briefed the opposition. Ken has had formal briefing sessions with the opposition on all this and engaged the opposition. And certainly there's been a lot of conversations which are well known and accepted by the government of the day of opposition leaders. So there's been openness. Openness constrained in the same way as I'm constrained currently in talking with you about what's in the white paper, but openness about the process and the interest in it. I would, certainly it's my personal fervent hope that that will be respected at the end of the day. And that the nature of the report, the nature of the process will engage a positive response right across the political process. Now, as I said before, there have got to be some things in there which won't attract bipartisan support, just particular issues. If you think about telecommunications in this country, there's a different approach to delivering the telecommunications infrastructure that we need. It's not that the opposition doesn't want to deliver a better telecommunications infrastructure. It's so central actually to doing all sorts of things efficiently within the country, but also in connecting with Asia. But they want to do it in a different way. And so there'll be issues of that kind. But they're not fundamental issues, I don't think, from the perspective of signing on to the broad thrust of what this process ought to deliver.
Okay, this may be the last question, I think.
Just on the question of languages, which is such a sort of interculture and understanding, there's the perspective from education and learning. The other end of that is that the public service and the private sector need to value the graduates that we do have who have had Asian language experience. And I have anecdotal evidence that that's not necessarily happening. And students will undertake language courses if they feel it's going to benefit their career. I feel the acknowledgement and the value placed on languages by both the public and the private sector has been lacking. And in addition, say with the ACT public service, there was an attempt some years ago to have a whole audit of the languages that people spoke within the ACT public service. And it just never took off and was never given a proper sort of support.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I know that there's a problem there, which is why it's so important to engage both the business community and the public sector in thinking about this. But I've got different evidence on what the reward to doing, investing in the heavy investment in language and literacy and Asia literacy is. I think sometimes people who enter the process, commitment to the process, have kind of rather naive ideas about, you know, where they should be at some point in their professional career, moving straight out of the ANU into some, you know, Japan relevant job if you've got the Japanese and so on immediately and so on, instead of seeing that investment as a part of a lifetime career that will bring you back to using that expertise and so on down the track. So a lot of the stories I hear are frustrations of that kind about loss of the potential of investment, as it were. In fact, if you do, as I've done, studies of what incomes people receive on graduation from the study of, say, economics in combination with an Asian language, the evidence suggests that the guy who does economics or the girl who does economics and combines it with Asian studies attracts a margin of reward in the workforce which is higher. So that suggests the market values it. So that's the case, then something's failing somewhere along the way in terms of the narrative or in terms of the incentive structure that's set up in business or the public sector, and that's clearly the case. There's a lot of problems with the way in which these incentives are provided. So often you have to find your way around barriers in order to realise the potential you've invested for. So it's a bit of a mixed story. It's a bit more mixed than it sometimes looks, that story, I think. I think the bottom line is that the Asia workforce capabilities exercise is a very important one in addressing that on the business front, that issue on the business front. But you know, the problem of addressing it on the business front and the public sector front relates to, you know, here you've got at the top making decisions about how to allocate resources and how to use resources with a particular suite of talents, including the Asia relevant talents in each of those sectors. And there's no question, you're absolutely right, that we haven't got that right yet and we have to put a big investment into it.
Okay, I think we'll call it a halt there.